Okay, everybody, welcome to the next installment of Beyond the Artist Stand. Yet again, it's an opportunity for everybody in the server to have a conversation about something about game development, art, design, anything in related, and just kind of showcase it to everybody here so that we can grow together and learn together and keep pushing our artist mind further. I don't really have to introduce Bryce because he's super infamous in basically this entire world. But Bryce Evans is an employee at 3 Pound Games, and he's one amazing programmer, artist, and a really good friend of mine. So, without further ado, Bryce, I'll let you kind of introduce yourself a little bit more, but go ahead and kind of take it over.
Hello. Thank you very much. That was a very kind intro. Hi, I'm Bryce. I have been working in Unity forever, since like Unity 3.5. Some of you don't even know how old that is, but trust me, it's really old and terrifying. Over those years of using it, I have started many a project and not finished a single one of them, but that's okay because I learned along the way. And so today, I hope to pass along some of that knowledge and maybe save some frustrations or just some general roadblocks in getting set up regarding VFX in Unity. And if I had timed that right, then the screen share would have popped up right when I said that. But here we are. There it is. Can everybody see my screen?
Yes.
Sweet. It says VFX in Unity.
A beginnerish guide to VFX in Unity. Yes.
There it is. Sweet. I found this slide template. So I didn't make this, but I thought particles and stuff, atoms, why not? What my goal is today is to get on record for all of you to either follow along with or to rewatch later at a slower pace, because some of the stuff if you don't have a project already set up, you'll have to download it, and sometimes that'll take a little bit. So, but the goal is to get everybody comfortable with a basic setup for a project, some basic visual elements, basically just a nice foundation for experimenting and playing around with VFX and Unity. I'm not going to dive extremely deep or get extremely granular when it comes to the individual systems, because there's a ton of good tutorials, and I have links at the end of this slideshow for that, and I can provide any additional links if anyone messages me and wants some more stuff. Like we can always we can make this like a living document and keep that stuff updated. So I just want to cover the basics enough so that we can talk about some practical examples and show how those could be set up. So I have 4 or 5 things already kind of authored that we can go through. So we're going to kind of be doing a little tour of a lot of different systems, because when you understand how these systems are related to each other inside Unity, and that they're really not simple, but they're easy to get into when you know like the order or some of the pitfalls or even just some of the possibilities of what you can do, it actually becomes really liberating creatively, because you can just kind of start off in a direction and get something spun up really, really quickly. So first thing we're going to talk about, well, actually, let me go to the next slide. So the key components of VFX and Unity, we have particles, materials, animation, and organization. So particles are great. Just in general, particle systems, you can have a lot of different things happening to these individual elements, changing the color over time, fading things in and out, movement. It's basically like a self-contained like animator kind of system where you have a start and an end, you have looping, you have curves, color control, all kinds of really interesting stuff that we'll look at. Materials are super important if you want something to glow, if you want something to like fade in a specific pattern or dissolve or have noise. Obviously, as artists, we know that materials are important, but even more so with VFX, because you can have individual shader properties and things that you can play around with and tweak to really make some interesting effects for relatively simply. That then goes to animations. So actually animating other elements. So particles and stuff have their own kind of, like I said, animation vibe to them, where they move and they rotate and they can scale and all that stuff within their own system. But sometimes you need other elements, just like meshes is a sphere or something that you need to rotate or move or scale or fade out. There might be some shader properties that you want to animate for it to change the color over time or something. And if it's outside a particle system, then you just use the animation system that's built inside Unity. So we'll take a look at that. And then organization in general is just something we're going to be talking about throughout the whole talk today, just because organization is amazing. And even though it's your own project, you should stay organized. And as soon as I open up Unity, you're going to be like, why did you say that? And then not organize your own project. And don't worry, don't do as I do as I say. It's mostly organization in terms of hierarchy and how you structure things is really what the important thing is. Basically, saving yourself time in the future. You don't want to have to recreate the same particle system 6 times just because you want to change the color a little bit. You would make that into a prefab and you create prefab variants and things like that. So we'll talk a little bit about that. There is one big thing, though, in terms of organization, and I'll show this. When you animate things in Unity using Unity's animator, if you so much as change one letter of the name of an object, it can completely disassociate it from the animation, and then you just lose that until you undo, and hopefully you can undo back to that. So that happened to me. It happens to me pretty much every time. It happened to me when I was preparing this demo. It happens to me all the time. So I'll illustrate that and maybe yell so that it really sinks in, that once you start animating something, you should really kind of try and preserve hierarchy and naming convention and stuff like that. So we'll get to that. We already talked about this, just slide stuff. Okay, so topics. What we're going to start with, and I'm not going to keep this up the whole time, so that can go away. We're going to start with the project setup. Then we're going to go into shaders and materials because it's important to get those at least set up on a basic level. Then we're going to talk about particle systems because those are super fun, and you can get a ton of really cool stuff going really quickly. Have a bunch of particles that we're going to go through, dust motes, snow, all kinds of stuff. Then we're going to go into the animator panel because that's kind of the most complex thing we're going to talk about today, to do our little final energy explosion sequence. That'll be really fun. And then we can do questions. So first things first, this is super basic stuff. I'm going to kind of go a little quick on this because a lot of you may have already done this before. If you haven't, then this will be like rewatch the video kind of material because I don't want to spend too much time on the basics of this stuff. But new project in Unity. I usually pick HDRP. Since I've started kind of getting sick of creating new projects all the time, I've created one HDRP project and one URP project. So that's high def render pipeline and universal render pipeline. And I just call them workspace. So this is basically like my workspace. So like anything I want to try, anything I want to experiment with, anything that I want, I want to try a new VFX thing, or I want to try some new code, or I want to try a new mechanic, or I want to, play around with a space shooter or something like that. Workspace is usually where I'll start because I can download all my plugins, I can download all my packages, and I can get my prefabs in, and I can get a nice workspace project just for everything to go in. So I highly encourage everybody in both Unity and Unreal to just create a workspace project, and that's just where you go to experiment, play around, try stuff, import stuff, whatever. If it grows to the point where you should spin that off into its own project, like if you're working towards a game or something like that, then that's where you can start breaking that out. You can select objects in Unity's project panel and export them as a package to a new project. But I've found that having a nice one location for like your casual projects and stuff like that is a really good thing. So HDRP. Standard stuff, you name your project, you say where you want it to go, and you create it. I'm not going to do that live because that takes forever. The project's already open. Thank you, Unity. All right, here we are in the project. So the first thing I do when I create a new project with HDRP is I come up to Window, and I go to the Package Manager, and I make sure that the Unity registry is selected from the dropdown here, because the high def render pipeline package here should already be installed if you picked an HDRP project to start. But it doesn't import these samples automatically, and these samples are great. So additional post-process data, procedural sky, particle system, and material samples. At the very least, this particle system shader samples, you'd want to import that. What this does is this gives you access to shader graphs for all these particle lits, particle unlits, like all these come with that. These two glow ones are mine. Those don't come with it, but we're going to talk about how to make these because glow with particles is almost essential, I think. But I also tend to like glow a lot more than I should. It hides imperfections in alphas, so I really like glow. And then the other thing is shader graph. This should be installed by default, I think, but if it's not, you just click import or download and then import here. And just make sure it's up to date. So again, that's window, package manager, high def render pipeline, at least the particle samples, import those, and then shader graph. Okay, so one important thing, in addition to having a workspace project, what I like to have is just like a visual scene that I can duplicate. That's just kind of a basic camera, sky, post-processing, simple plane, and a directional light that is set up in a way that I like, so that I can just duplicate that, and I'm already feeling good about how it looks. Nothing is more sad to me than when I create like a new like basic scene and it's just the standard Unity sky and scene that I've been looking at for the last like 10 years, and it's like, oh, I'm starting over, aren't I? So I really like having just a go-to scene that's like, okay, cool, like this looks better than default. It's a little bit much. The bloom's a little high and there's a lot of fog, but you would develop kind of your own fun little landing scene that you like. The important thing about this is the setup for things like bloom in the post-processing, because that's really where you can get your glow and stuff to really have nice effects. So I'm going to talk about that pretty briefly. So when you create a new scene and you select, I would pick one of the HDRP scenes because it'll already have some elements in there for you. So for example, I pick a basic one. Well, I already did that. Let me open it. So we get the main camera, directional light, sky and fog volume. So that's all pretty standard stuff that it adds for you. What I like to do is I like to come into the volume and I like to change some of these things around. So I usually leave the fog and exposure for now. I almost always change my physically based sky to an HDR sky. I just like the control that it gives you. So the way to do that is in the visual environment, we can switch from physically based sky to gradient or HDR sky. Sometimes gradient's better because it's nice and simple. And if I toggle off the physically based sky and I add a gradient sky, I click these all on. Woo. And I turn the exposure up, you can see that now I have gradient that I can control. So if I really wanted to be specific about the color, if I wanted to go for like a sunset kind of vibe or something, I don't know, you could use gradient. Or if you want to go for something more, a little more realistic or something like that, you could go with HDRI sky. So again, I'll just remove this. I'll remove my physically based sky as well. I'm just right clicking on these to remove them. And so now if I add an HDRI sky, there it is. And if I find a cube map, turn my exposure up, there it is. So there's a nice kind of cartoony sky. This is from a Sky Pack Fantasy Skybox free on the Unity Asset Store. So that's a really nice pack for just different skyboxes. So as I scroll through this list, you can see there's some nice, again, just kind of stylized skyboxes. I also have this one. This is the one I'm using in my scene because it's like a nice night scene with some interesting lighting and things like that in the distance. When this kind of cuts through fog, it looks fun. So really quickly, the way you can add your own HDRs, and I've linked this in the slides document, is Polyhaven right here. So Polyhaven used to be HDRI Haven. So you just browse HDRIs, find one that you like this one. You pick the setting, and I'll do 2K. You can do EXR HDR, I don't think it matters. And then you just click download. Once you have that downloaded in Unity, when you select the file, you want to make sure you come up to texture shape and set it to cube. The default will be 2D, which means it's just flat. But because this is an HDR file, you can set it to cube and it'll understand what that means. So you can see that it's actually a little skybox here. When that is set to cube, you'll see that it's allowed then to be slotted into the HDR sky. So that's what I did there. In addition to these skybox settings, when you click Add Override, because this is just a volume in general, you have access to all the post-processing, the bloom, color curves, depth of field, all these kind of settings that you can use to kind of punch up your scene a little bit. What's nice about that is it's all saved in this profile. So I have a sky and post-process profile in my other scene. So I'll save this scene just for example. So if I come back here and I pick my sky and fog, you can see that this sky and post-process is right here. So all of these settings are saved in this file. So if I come back to my outdoor scene and I select the sky and fog volume and I drag this into the profile slot, you can see it changes right away, which is really nice. So you can have multiple of these. I could duplicate this. You should really name these. Like I said, don't worry about my terrible naming convention. So this should be like sky and post-process _foggy red or something like that. Something descriptive, just so it's not 1, 2, 3, 4. And then we'll make this one sky and post-process foggy blue, for example. And so I can put this on my profile here, and then I could maybe come into the fog, and you can see I had the fog set to be very red, and I could set this to be blue. Maybe I turn down some of the attenuation distance, or turn up the attenuation distance maybe. You know, I could play around with this. I'm not going to go through and tweak too much, but you can see that you can get some interesting looks very quickly just by duplicating post-process. So really quickly running through for the sake of the video, my post-process setup here. So again, I have an HDRI sky. That's all good. Physically based sky is turned off. I have my fog settings. There they are. Pause if you need to, if you want to duplicate them exactly. I can also just throw some of these things just right into the Discord. So I should be able to throw this post-processing setting into the Discord, or even, on Google Drive to link it in the YouTube description or something. And you should be able to just drag this in and set it up because it's all internal. Exposure, I set this to fixed, so I have control over it. Sometimes it'll default to auto histogram, which means if you're looking at something really dark, it'll brighten it. And if you look at something really bright, it'll darken it. And I don't like that it takes that control away. I do that for everything. If I'm in Unreal, that's the first thing I turn off is auto exposure. HDRI sky, of course, which we just talked about. Indirect lighting controller is so that you can have a general ambient light in the scene. I like this because if scenes get too dark or if I don't want to bother with adding a bunch of lighting, I use this indirect lighting controller, and you just adjust the lighting strength here. Bloom, of course. Usually I just use the default stuff. Sometimes I'll tweak the intensity, but I usually don't mess with this too much until I actually have something like a particle or something in the scene that's glowing, and then I might tweak this. But typically you can just tweak glow on the individual elements in the scene themselves, and you can leave this kind of as is. If you're tweaking this too much, you'll get into a situation that's not great where you'll tweak the bloom here for a particle that's currently playing, and it'll look great. Then you'll hide that one, and you'll play a different particle you made earlier, and it'll be blown out and look like nonsense because you've adjusted this, and maybe this was already really bright on its own. So that's why I usually like to make my adjustments local and keep this kind of global stuff as is. Vignette, classic. Get these nice edges on the screen here. Makes it look real nice. Film grain, again, anything that I can hide an imperfection with, I will usually turn on and probably turn up a little too high. So I could definitely dial that back a little bit, but whatever. Chromatic aberration is a classic. It's almost a joke at this point in our department where it's just like, yeah, throw on chromatic aberration, you got yourself a video game. Ambient occlusion just for fun. And then color adjustments, you can make little tweaks here. Sometimes I like to mess with the saturation and contrast mostly. Turn down the saturation a little bit, turn up the contrast a little bit. It makes it a little poppier. It can be a little bit much at times, but I think it's fine for now. Okay, that was really quick. Sorry if that moved really fast. Kind of blowing through that just basic setup stuff, but that's so we can get on to the good stuff. So, shaders and materials. Let's first take a look at the things that we can make just with particles. So this is the first one that I have made. I'm going to hit play so that it just plays without me having to deal with it. So this is like a pickup, like an example of a pickup. It's a cube with a glowing material on it. It could be a health pickup. It could be something else. It's got a couple sparkles that are just kind of raising up, like it's mystical or it's trying to catch your attention, whatever. That's just a simple particle effect there. We have fireball. This is using an animated texture for the fire and the smoke. So we'll talk about how we can use animated textures, texture sheets, and things like that to create more complex animation. I have a rain effect. Not only is the rain a particle system, but the splashes are using particle collision and are considered a sub-emitter. So the splashes are actually also a particle system that's being told to activate when this first particle hits this plane that I have here. We also have this explosion sequence. So this explosion sequence is using two particle systems and a mesh with a dissolve shader that's on the material itself that we're tweaking. So this is an example of using the animator, like we talked about, using materials, like we talked about, and using particle systems. So combining these things together pretty simply can create an interesting effect. And then the last thing, some of you in here might recognize this from Concept and Tech 2, but I have this little heavenly beam that blasts on down and tracks. If anyone's played Elden Ring, this was inspired by Placidusax, the hidden dragon boss. He does this beam attack like this, and it's super cool, super satisfying. Okay, so let's get cracking with this first one. So first things first, talking about shader graph so that you can set up shaders with a little bit more control. So what I had done is created a shader for a general particle glow. So to create a shader, you can just right-click in the project panel and go to Create Shader. I wanted an unlit shader, so I selected Unlit, and then I named it Particle Glow Unlit, and that is here. So when you create the shader, you have this shader graph asset that shows up. So if you double click this, it should open up the shader graph window. So here that is. And I can clean some of this up. So I have a link to a video from Brackeys, good old Brackeys, about shader graph, going through how it works and how to use it and examples and stuff like that. Brackeys is actually where I got that dissolve shader from. So that'll those two videos, the dissolve shader and the shader graph video, will be linked in the slides as well. So you can check those out at your leisure. But basically, if you've used Unreal Materials before, this should look super familiar. It's a node-based material editor. If you've used, Maya has this in some fashion. Blender does. Basically, nodes are the way to go. It creates these outputs. All we really care about in this case, we don't really need to worry about all the vertex stuff. This is if you were doing if you want a grass to kind of sway in the wind, this is where you could start to distort some vertex positions and things like that. But we're just concerned with color, emission, and alpha. We want color because we want to be able to set what the actual color is. We want emission because we want it to be able to glow. That's what emission provides, is the ability to intensify the color past the normal threshold so that it starts to glow. And then alpha so that we can fade things in and out. So the way that shader graph typically works is you will create nodes that are relevant to what you need, what kind of functionality you need. And then you'll create parameters or properties, for things that you want to be able to change in the inspector. So for example, if we look at this particle system here, We can see this is using my particle glow unlit shader. I'll show you how to set that up in a bit. But we can see that I have a main text, I have emissive tint, emissive strength, and unlit color. You'll see that these names directly match the names of these properties over here. So if I know that I want to expose a color and I want to be able to manipulate that color from the inspector, I just click the plus button and I just pick the parameter that I want. In this case, I could pick color. So my unlit color here, if I turn on my graph inspector, you can see it's called unlit color. Default is white, mode is default, precision inherent. All this stuff is just kind of things that you can tweak if you need to. For example, you'll notice that my emissive tint says HDR, my unlit color does not. That's because my emissive tint mode is set to HDR. What that gives me is this extra slider for intensity. That's where my glow comes from. So this is pretty standard stuff. If you want a texture, if you want just a float, so my emissive strength is just a float, it's just one number. My main texture is a texture field. So you kind of determine what you're going to need. You create that property, and then you can just drag it into the graph. Again, pretty standard workflow stuff. So what I have going on here for my unlit glow particle is I have a texture, because it's important to have when you want to define the shape of a particle. If you don't have a texture, it'll just be a solid square. Sometimes it's nice if you have like a low poly or pixel kind of vibe. But in most cases, you want to actually use an alpha for your texture so that it has a nice look to it. So that's what this texture is for. I multiply it by a color. Sometimes you want to tint it. Particle vertex color is so that it can hook into the actual particle system colors, because we can define a range of colors through the actual particle system that gets applied down onto the actual material itself. And in this case, I'm multiplying that back into the texture. And then I have my emissive tint and strength that's going into the emission slot. Now, as we're going to see, this should be cleaned up a little bit because it's actually not inheriting the particle color at the moment. We're just setting the particle color directly in the material. That was an older workflow that I had that I wanted to change and just haven't. So this is another shader that I can just link again in the Discord or put up on a Google Drive, and you can just download my particle glow lit, glow unlit, and unlit emissive. This unlit emissive is for just regular objects, not particles. So that's something that you could just download and throw on stuff if you'd like. Or, like I said, if you wanted to go in and recreate it, the key thing here is just having a texture, color, particle color, plugging that all in, and then having emissive and plugging that in as well. After watching the shader graph video from Bryce, and after watching his dissolve video, you'll have a lot of examples to play with, and you can start tweaking things and start making this more tailored to what you would want it to look like. Okay, so that's creating shaders. That's adding some custom functionality to those as you see fit. I still believe there is no default like glow particle that ships with Unity directly through the HDRE package manager or anything, or HDRP, which is kind of disappointing because glow is really great. So like I said, you can basically create that yourself in the emission slot, or you could just download the shaders that I put up there. Okay, so let's talk about particles. I'm going to hide this, and I'm going to create a new particle system. So there are usually two things that you create when you create a particle effect. You create the actual particle system itself, and you create a material for that particle system. Materials are global, so if you create one material and add it to 3 particle systems, all 3 particle systems are going to be sharing that material. So if you change that material for one, it's going to change it for all of them. So, for example, if I had a yellow glow material and I put that on 3 different particle systems, then I go onto the second particle system and change it to blue. It's going to change the core material to blue, and so all 3 particle systems that are using that are now going to be blue. It's a bit tedious sometimes, but I really like having separate materials for everything because you can be very, very specific and not worry about ruining anything retroactively as you go through. So I'm going to right-click and create an effect particle system. And this gives us our base particle system game object. Then the next thing I'm going to do, and again, organization, you should put this in a materials folder. I'm not going to, so that I can just show you right here and not have to dig through like this whole list of stuff. So in the assets folder, I'm just going to right click and I'm going to create a material. Now we should be naming things. So this is going to be, this will be our dust. No, this will be snow. We'll make snow. So I'm going to call this snow FX underscore mat for material. So descriptive name is nice. I'm also going to rename this particle system up here. I'm going to call this snow FX underscore PS for particle system. So on my material, if I select it here, I'm going to come up to the shader type and I'm going to go to shader graphs, which is where your shader graphs default to. And I'm going to find my particle glow unlit. Snow doesn't really glow, but again, I like to use glow sometimes to hide imperfections. Now that I have that selected, I'm just going to drag this material directly onto my particle system in the hierarchy, and it will add it automatically. If I click on this particle system now and scroll down to the bottom, just like any other game object in Unity, we have a material slot. So I can expand this and I can set this up as I need to. So I usually start with just the default particle texture. So if you click on a texture slot and you just type default, you'll see default particle here. That just ships with Unity to the point where it doesn't even exist. You can't even select it in the project. It just is there. Now we might notice a bit of a problem. There's no alpha. It's just square. So for any material, any standard material, I suppose, for Unity, we can just change the surface type to transparent. And we can see now that it's actually honoring the transparency. Sometimes I like to change the blending mode for particles to additive. We can see that that gets rid of a lot of the kind of black like halo that's around these things. You could also do pre-multiply, but I prefer additive. If you wanted to receive fog, you could keep that on or check it off. The rest of the stuff doesn't really matter unless it's a very specific issue. And then for the shader that I'm using currently, for the emissive tint, if I set this to white and I turn the intensity up 10, I can then adjust the emissive strength. And we can see the bigger I make this, I could probably multiply this in the shader itself, but we can see it's glowing. So this is fun. They're like little magic motes or something. I'm going to dial that down so that we're not staring at the sun the whole time. So I'm just going to go with 1 because it's snow. Snow shouldn't glow that much. A little bit maybe because it's reflecting snow. So, okay, so we created a particle system. We didn't do anything to it yet. We created a material. We set the shader of that material to my shader graph particle glow unlit. If you want to use Unity's default stuff, that's these. Still in the same spots in the shader graph, so you can just pick one of these if you want. I like to keep it simple though. We set the surface type to transparent, and we set the blending mode to additive, so we get this nice soft particle effect. And in my case, I just turned up the intensity of my HDR color and set the tint and emissive strength colors on those. So what we're going to do next is start actually adjusting the particle system itself. Now, I'm not going to go through every single element of the particle system itself, but what I will do is, okay, so I have a link for that, so that's good. There are some key things to keep in mind with the particle system in Unity. The biggest things that are really let you kind of take off when it comes to particle systems is random numbers. They're just amazing because, life is chaotic and everything seems random. So all the more realistic if you can make things really random and chaotic. And curves. Curves are great because you can really tweak the feeling of some of these animations and things like that. So what I'm going to do in this case, like I said, I'm going to have a link for like going through the particle system itself, like line by line, like in like a tutorial style fashion. Instead here, I'm just going to go to the things that are relevant to what we're going to be authoring with these effects. So when you approach it this way, I find that this is the best way to approach it because then you're just focusing on the things that you need, and you'll stumble on other things like accidentally as you experiment, and be like, oh, that's a really cool thing. Make notes. I have like a notes document of like, hey, I don't want this for this particle effect, but this one parameter would be great for lightning, or this would be great for an explosion, or this would be great somewhere else. You will not remember that. Like you're like, oh, cool, I'm definitely gonna remember that. You won't. So you should write it down. Write down like, yeah, hey, if the 3D start size is really great for this kind of thing. I'm not going to use it right now, but it'll be great. So as you're learning these things, make note of what these things do, not just mentally, actually write it down. It'll be really beneficial when you start to have a list of things that you can refer to. So in this case, I want snow. Snow doesn't go up, at least not here. So I'm going to rotate my particle system down so that it's facing towards the ground. And I want to move it up a little bit. I'm going to turn on my gizmos. Well, maybe not. We'll see. Okay, so I've rotated this particle system so it's facing down. That's great. I'm going to start to look through what I might be able to adjust to get more of a snow feel. One of the first things that you should look at is this shape tab. The shape tab determines the shape of the emitter, not the shape of the particle, the shape of the emitter. So you can see that my particles are spawning from the top of this cone, and they are moving at a minimum of straight down and at a maximum of the maximum outer angle of this cone. So if I were to adjust the angle of the cone, you can see the particles are now emitting in a much wider area. And if I tighten it up, you can see that they're going pretty much straight up and down. The radius, controls the area that it comes through. So this is starting to look kind of nice. A nice round area. The particles are starting at the top and they're floating down. So that works. Again, play with this. Switch the shape, switch all of these parameters, play around with these. Just see what they do and make notes. Because there's you can see just in shape, there's so many. Like we won't be able to go through all of them, but again, experimenting with this stuff or even just asking. Throw something up in the Discord or reach out and just be like, hey, I want something that mimics this. I want it to look like a splash. And I'd be like, okay, cool. You're definitely going to want the gravity modifier for something that splashes, because then that'll go up in the air and then it'll have a natural like gravity fall off curve to fall down. So reach out. I will give you, I'll give you what the parameter actually is, or I'll be like, cool, I didn't know that either. And then we'll find out together. So this is not bad for snow. It's looking kind of nice. Floating down. I think the particles are a little big. So if we come up to our kind of base parameters, you can see we have things like duration, looping, lifetime, speed, size, rotation, gravity, things like that. So again, something we can play with. So start size. I'm going to just turn this down till we get something. And I'm kind of bouncing between looking at it in the view and from my camera angle. So from my camera angle, these are looking a little bit big. I could just move the particle system. I could just move my camera. I'm just going to leave it like that for now. Now, all snowflakes are not the same size. Most things are not all identical in size. And even if they are, it might look a little bit robotic. Just like with animation, for those of you that are familiar with animation, when you move your arm, you don't just move your arm at a linear speed from one place to the next. That's what a robot does. There's curves to it. There's randomness to it. So this is one of those key tenets of particle systems is this right here. If you click the drop down next to most things, you can change the field type. So right now this is a constant, which means it's just a single number. Some things you'll really want to curve for. We'll look at that when we do like scale over time. But for this, random between two constants, this is huge. I put this on almost everything because it adds so much variety for free. So if I pick random between constants here, I can make a 3D start, or no, just a regular start size of, I could say like 0.2 and 0.4. Now this is obviously very subtle, but you can see now, as these particles spawn in, some of them spawn in at 0.2, some of them spawn in at 0.4, some of them spawn in at any number in between those two. I can make this really exaggerated. If I do between 0.2 and 5, you can see we have little tiny particles and we have huge. You want to be subtle about this, but I find that, something 0.2 and 0.45, that looks good to me. Lifetime and speed, same thing. I'm going to do random between two constants for lifetime. Right now, these are living for 5 seconds. You can see how far they're going. Maybe I don't want them to live for that long, so I might go something like 2 and 3. While I'm here, I might set my duration to 1. I like setting a default duration of 1. I feel it's a little more consistent. It's easy to multiply with versus like 5. In this case, because they're piercing through the ground, it doesn't really matter about the lifetime because they're kind of going off screen before they die. I'm going to make this a little bit more exaggerated so that we can see these kind of disappearing. I'll tweak this back later, but I just want to show you some of the fade out effects that we can have. Start speed. Again, random between two constants. Let's do 5 and 10, make it really exaggerated. So you can see that some of these are kind of floating gently, and some of them are kind of shooting down. That's the speed that they're spawning at. Now for snow, we don't need this much variety. So between like maybe 5 and 6. Sometimes if I find that 5 is a nice middle value, I'll go like -1 + 1, or like -2 + 2. So maybe we do 4 and 6 here to get some nice variety. And increase the lifetime back to maybe 0.5 and 1, so we get a little more float. Perfect. Okay, so another thing I want more of these. I want more particles. Be careful with this. If you do too many, Unity can hang and then maybe crash. So this is a really easy one to explain. So rate over time is just how many particles will spawn per second. So if I increase this, now it's like really snowing. Check that out. Have fun. Like I said, don't go too wild with this. This will start to slow down your machine. But this, whatever, this is fun. So maybe this is the amount of snow that we want. When you work with particle systems, you're going to work kind of cyclically. You're gonna work in cycles. Almost everything you change will potentially cause you to want to go back and alter a different thing. And that's totally fine. That's a great workflow to have. So I increased the rate over time. Let's make this just an even 800. And I'm saying, okay, now that I did that, because there's so many of these, they actually feel a little bit big. So I'm going to come back up and I'm going to say my start size is maybe 0.1 and 0.3. Really dial that down. Just because. Maybe I feel that that's a little too much. Whatever. I can keep tweaking it if I need to. Now, these particles are just kind of popping out of existence. They're moving pretty quick, so it's sometimes difficult to tell. I wouldn't be too bothered by this. But if it did bother you, what we could do is we could start to look at all these over lifetimes and by speeds, this kind of chunk right here. One of the biggest ones is color over lifetime, and the other biggest one is size over lifetime. So if I check color over lifetime, and I click on this color swatch, this is actually a gradient swatch. And there's some default gradients, at least there should be. So you can select a preset, or this is just standard gradient stuff, just like you have in Photoshop or whatever. The top is the alpha, and the bottom is the color. So I can set up an alpha that starts completely transparent and then fades in, and then I could have it last for a while and then fade out. So if I do this really exaggerated, you can see now, as these particles get to the end of their life, you can see they're fading now instead of snapping out of existence. So I can move this back over here so that they fade a little bit quicker, like they hit the ground and melt or something. And then the other one was size over lifetime. So again, I'll exaggerate this quite a bit. Size over lifetime is a curve. If you click on the curve, it will become active down here in the curve editor. If you don't see this, it's really hidden and obnoxious because I forget about this all the time. I'll be clicking this curve and I'm like, okay, my Unity inspector is broken or my editor's acting weird because my curve isn't popping up. It is. It's just down here. So you can either click and drag this up, or you can single click it and it'll pop up, and that's where your curve is. When it's grayscale here, it's not active, and when it has color, it's active. So this is basically saying, over the lifetime of the particle, multiply the scale by this number, wherever it is on the graph. So in this case, it's starting at a scale of 0 when it is born, and then as it goes through its lifetime, it's increasing its scale until the end, where it will be as big as it's supposed to be, and then it'll fade out. I could flip this, so it starts at the normal scale and gets smaller as it comes down, which you can see. This is great for like drips, or like kind of sparks. Sparks is more of an alpha fade, because if you think about like a real life spark, it's losing like energy, so it's like fading. Drips are almost like a bigger droplet up top that are kind of the water is kind of breaking apart as it falls and it's getting smaller or whatever. Not technically, but like visually, it kind of looks like that. So this would be great for something dripping. Not so great for snow though. And you can edit these curves. You can double click to add points. You can make these get pretty wacky if you wanted to. So in this case, it's like really exaggerated, that they start really small, get really huge, get really small, get really huge, and then fade out. Kind of subtle. I'm just going to undo that. So I don't really need size over lifetime for snow. I like a consistent size. And the last thing that would be interesting for snow is this noise. So I'm going to turn on noise, and I'm going to, again, exaggerate this. You can see when I turn that on, the particles are now kind of waving back and forth. What's happening is it's using this black and white image to push and pull the position of each particle based on the gray value of the pixel of this texture. So I believe if it hits white, it moves like very intensely in one direction. If it hits black, it either doesn't move or it moves in the opposite direction. I'm not exactly sure. And then gray is basically anything in between. If we increase the strength of this, you can see things get a little chaotic. This is like a blizzard now, which is fun. So this would be one of those times where you'd be like, okay, noise strength for snow equals blizzard. And you'd make a note of that. I'm going to put this back to 1, maybe even a little bit less. Frequency is kind of the actual noisiness of it. So if we increase the frequency a lot, maybe not that much, and we increase the strength, you can see now it's being pushed a great amount due to the strength, and it's waving back and forth a lot because of how granular the noise frequency has become. This would be great if you had a light, and this was a lot smaller. You could make like little glow bugs buzzing around a light, or moths or something, right? Because this looks like bugs or flies or something, because of this kind of furious pattern. So if you were to take this and then like change the emitter shape, let's say we change the emitter shape to a sphere, and I shrink the radius down to something like this, and I shrink the count down to maybe 100, and then maybe the speed to like 1 and 2. You can see now if I had like an emissive light or something glowing. In fact, let's do that real quick. Why not? We're here. Let's do it. I put a sphere there. I throw a glow on this sphere, so I make a material. I call it, I don't know, light glow. Why not? I'm going to set this to my shader graph unlit emissive. I'm going to put that on the sphere. I'm going to set my color to white and the intensity, and I'm going to increase that. So now I got like a little glowy light that's got like some bugs chilling around it. Right? And that was like, we're making snow, but like we just had like 2 tweaks and it's now a completely different thing, right? So this is where prefabs can come into play in a really cool way. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to copy this, and I'm going to undo and pretend that we did this in the correct order. So I'm going to undo all the way back till this is snow again. There we go. I'm going to paste this little effect that we were doing there. And it ruined my material. I'm just going to put that. Well, we don't really need that. It's whatever. Complete that. So let's say that I had this snow, and I was like, I really like this, but a couple tweaks, I can make something else that also looks really cool. What you would do is you can just drag this particle system down into the project window, and it'll create a prefab of it. Then what you could do, if I delete this, what you could do with this prefab is you could drag another instance of it out. I can hide the first one. If I select this prefab, now I can make tweaks to this knowing that I'm not destroying anything. My actual snow effects object and particle system is preserved. If I click on this duplicate, this is where I can come in and I can make those changes, right? My start speed, I made like 1 and 3. I made the shape a sphere, changed the radius to be really small. I changed the count to 100. So now, and the noise. I set the noise frequency to be a lot and the intensity to be a lot. So there we go. So now I got my bugs. I can now rename this to bug light FX underscore particle system. And now if I drag this into my project panel, it's going to say, hey, do you want to make an original prefab or a prefab variant? In this case, it's different enough. I'm going to make an original prefab of this. But if this was something where you had snow and then you wanted like green snow because you're on, it looks like alien pollen or something, you could do a prefab variant, and then anything you change on the main prefab, the snow, like the size of the particles, the prefab variant will inherit. Anything you change on the prefab variant, like color, the parent will not inherit. So you could change things and keep a link between them if you wanted to. But in my case, I'm just going to do original prefab. So now I have both of these things non-destructive. I have my snow, and I have my bug light. So when you feel, and when you're authoring a particle system or an effect or anything like that, when you feel like you're starting to get to like, okay, there's like 3 or 4 other cool effects I could make with this, start making prefabs. Prefab this, it preserves it, duplicate it, make a bunch of changes, save that as an original prefab. So prefab is kind of like take a snapshot of what you have so that you can mess with it and do other things to it and not have to worry about having to undo or go back or do other things to it. So I really encourage using the prefabs, at least if you don't use variants, because sometimes it's hard to wrap your head around variants until you use it practically. At least use just a bunch of original prefabs so that you have these changes stick. Okay, so for snow, maybe I'll increase the strength just a little bit. Maybe I'll increase the frequency a little bit, but we have this nice kind of drifting snow. It's moving too fast. Let's go 1 and 2. Notice when I change the speed, it's now disappearing before it gets into my camera view. And that's because its lifetime is too small for the speed it's going at. So if I increase the lifetime now between like 3 and 5, you can see now they actually show up because they're living long enough at their speed to actually get down to where I need them to be. So this is a pretty good snow. It's not bad. It's kind of maybe a little bit intense with the noise. Maybe it's kind of a windy day or whatever. They're not maybe falling as gently as they could, but that's fine. So I'm good with that. If it's a prefab already and you want to commit those changes, you just come over to overrides, apply all, and now every instance of this snow prefab will have those changes apply. What's nice about this is you could put this on like your player and it would constantly follow the player and it would look like it was snowing everywhere instead of having to scale it. If you were to do that though, you'll notice, so another example we can talk about. As I move this, see how all of the particles are moving? Sometimes you don't want that. Sometimes you want the particles to persist where they are and just move the emitter. What that is the simulation space right here. So right now it's local, which means these particles are moving with the emitter. If I switch the simulation space to world, you'll see as I move the emitter, See how it's leaving behind particles now? This is more like if you had a snow machine. It's essentially spawning the particle and then unparenting it so that it stays where it is in the world and doesn't move with the emitter. Another cool thing we could try to apply with this is in this emission, instead of rate over time, which is just constantly spawning particles, we can set this to 0, and we can set the rate over distance to something like 200. What this means is for every unit that we move, it'll spawn this amount of particles. So don't copy this number to here. That would be a lot, which we'll see. So as I move this, see how particles are spawning? Only when I move it, though. So if I move it a lot, you can see a lot of particles are spawning. Now, right now, we're hitting our particle cap. If I move this too quickly, you can see we're capping it out. And that's because right here, our max particles is set to 1,000. Careful changing this. If you set this too high, things could go bad. Okay, so that's snow. We've hit the hour mark, so I'm going to run through just how I set these up so you can see that, and then we can get to questions. It's running a little bit over, I apologize. So the order that we're going in, so this sparkle effects, if I turn this on and I look at it, in order for the particles to actually play, you need to have them selected. So if I don't select them, they won't play. So I usually just like to shift select everything. If you don't want this gizmo to be in your way, you can just hit Q, and that gives you the hand tool, which doesn't have a gizmo. So I'm going to restart this. So I have some particles here that are spawning. If we look at this first particle system, you can see it's just spawning these in 3 per second. I don't want a lot. I just want a couple. The shape is edge, and we can see, if I get really close, edge is just this line. Instead of these things spawning in a circle or in a sphere or in a cone, they're just spawning somewhere along this point or along this line. And I can change the radius of this down to a single point. So this is cool for I think like pickups in Elden Ring have like a little glow to them or something that you could have just spawning in one spot. I spread it out over this edge just so there was a little bit of variety. Again, just color by lifetime, size over lifetime. So I'm just fading them in and out, as you can see here. And my size is just going up. So they're just scaling up and then fading out. There's not really anything else to that one. So I duplicated that, as you could tell, because I didn't rename it. And I gave it a little bit more speed. In this case, I actually just used a reverse gravity modifier to make them go up on kind of a natural curve. So just setting gravity modifier to negative makes it go up instead of down. Same thing. Color over lifetime, size over lifetime. That's it. On these materials, I am using some alphas. So I purchased an particle effects pack from good old Mirza. He's really was, and I think still is, maybe really big in like the VFX Unity scene. I've linked his channel as well. He has a ton of amazing tutorials for the particle system. He sells a VFX pack. It's broken now because it's not built for render pipeline. So HDRP, the shaders don't work, all that kind of stuff. I basically bought it knowing that because the amount of alpha that this pack comes with is huge. So just there's so many good alphas in this pack that I just didn't want to make myself. You absolutely can. You can make any of these yourself. You just go into Photoshop, Illustrator, whatever, and you can make this stuff. So if you ever need something additional, like a cool ring or something like that, or a snowflake, what do you know? You can make these in Photoshop, import them into Unity, and bring them in. So for example, if I quickly bounce back over to my snow, and I go down to my material here, snow, where are you?
You have it set to when you move, it spawns.
Oh, thank you so much. I forgot I did that. Thank you. I would have been staring at that for a while. So in this case, if you find a snowflake alpha, you can find alphas anywhere. And I'm sure you all know that. Like you can find ZBrush alphas, you can find substance alphas, like basically anything that has an alpha, a black and white image with transparency, you can use for this. So I can drag this snowflake over here, and now look, they're all snowflakes. What I like about Mirza's channel is you can follow along with everything and just not use the alphas he's using, because everything else is just using Unity's default systems. So yeah, you could make this sparkle effect, and it might not have the exact sparkle like that, but that's okay. It still looks good without it. So if I get rid of this, not get rid of it. If I put the default particle back on, you still get the same effect. It doesn't look as, intentional, you could say. Same thing here, if I do that. Right? You still get the idea. If you look down here, you still get the motion. You still get the idea of that. And then you can, like I said, come back in and author your own alphas if you want to punch up the look. In fact, I think this looks a little kind of fake, but it's fine. From far away, it looks fine. So the sparkle effects example that I have here is just straight up particle systems stuff. It's just your standard setup, emission, shape, and then your color size. Boom. The rain effects, same thing, pretty much. Basic setup. My emission, in this case, I'm at 500 over time. My shape, I picked a box. Just so that I could, really dictate exactly where things were coming out with some corners. This is great if you wanted to model this volume around buildings and stuff, so it's not raining inside. It's a lot easier to use a box around corners than it is a sphere, obviously. What's special about this one is I'm using collision and a sub-emitter. So what's happening is in the collision tab, I can specify a type. Plane is the default. And I have a plane in my scene, and I just dragged that plane into this slot, and it created a collider. So without the sub-emitter, this rain is just colliding with the plane. If I turn off the collision, you can see that the rain's actually going through it. When I turn on collision, you can see the particles are stopping directly at that plane. This is great to do rain over the roof of a building. Instead of messing with lifetime and size and speed to make sure it doesn't clip through the building, you could just turn on collision and set a plane up, and then you can guarantee it won't pierce through. With sub-emitter, if we turn this on, we can specify a type. So it's essentially saying, when do you want me to emit the sub-particle system? Birth is basically when this parent particle is born, also spawn a sub-emitter. Death is when it's done. Trigger, collision, manual, all these things. Collision, if I pick that, and I specify this particle system, which if we isolate on its own, if we look at that, where is it? Restart. There it is. You can see it's just a little splash. This is just another particle system. My shape is edge set to 1, or 0.0001, so it just emits in place. My emission is just a burst, which is play once, so it just bursts one particle. So if I put that back on here, essentially what we're telling our main particle system to do is, when you've collided with something, spawn a sub-emitter, and this is the sub-emitter to spawn. So now, anytime one of these raindrop particles hits the plane that I've specified, it will spawn the sub-emitter. So if I wanted this to spawn my sparkle effect, for example, this little has to be on to see it. I could use this instead. I could drag this down onto my raindrops. I could turn off this one, and I could drag this into the particle system to spawn. Is it too small to see? Oh, it might be too small to see. But any particle you can put here will be spawned when this thing gets hit. You could also do things, like I said, on death. Okay, let's hide those and quickly go through the explosion, because the explosion's the other one. So fireball, we won't go through just because it's not super complicated, but it uses texture sheet animation. That's something that's a little bit more in depth. So I can, if anyone's interested in that, we could talk in a bit maybe. But the big one is this, the explosion effect. So the way that I made this is I created the sphere. It's just a simple sphere. I applied this rotation constraint. Actually doesn't do anything. Neither does this rotator. I applied the Brachy's dissolve material, which I'll show you here. So this is another one that I linked in the presentation. So this dissolve shader just makes it so that you can change this dissolve amount. And it uses a noise texture to determine where it should make a pixel transparent or not. So just by scrubbing back and forth through this, you can see we get this really, really cool effect, especially with the glow. So what I did is I opened up the animation panel. You go to Window, Animation, Animation. In the animation panel, and this is again, like I'll have a tutorial about how to use the animation in Unity, but it's basically a standard animation timeline. You have a record button. When this is enabled, anything you change will be recorded. So be careful with that. Make sure that this comes back. Turn this back on. So what's happening here is I am telling the sphere to rotate, scale up. Then I'm telling it to finish its dissolve, and then it's scaling back down. I'm also enabling the shockwave particle effect, and then I'm enabling this burst particle effect. And again, these are just, again, standard particle systems. So if I look at this first particle system, this burst, like that. Again, standard setup, random lifetime, random start speed. This is a pretty extreme random start speed. So you can see some of them move very slowly. Some of them move really quickly. Just color over lifetime, so it fades, and size over lifetime, so it gets really small as it gets further away from the center. Simple as that. For the shockwave, same thing like my raindrop. In fact, I duplicated the shockwave to make the raindrop splash effect. A burst of 1, so 1 just shows up. The shape is edge, as tiny as you can make it, so it spawns right in the center. And again, color over lifetime, size over lifetime. So you can see the pattern here, right? It's really about the first 3 parameters, your particle system itself, the emission and the shape, and then color over lifetime, size over lifetime are really, really big. So I will recreate this sphere effect that we have here, and then we'll go to questions so that we don't take too long. So what I did, I'm going to hide this one. I'm not going to recreate it exactly, but I'll show you the steps. So I created a sphere. There it is. I gave it a material. Let's just use the same material that this one has. Test dissolve. Great name. And I'm going to zero this out just so we can see it. There it is. So I have this material. It's glowing. It has this dissolve that I can animate. Right now it's set to do preserve specularity or something. It's weird. Anyway, so when you want to create an animation, it is super, 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 super important to create an empty game object to be the parent. It's not always relevant, but it's always a safe thing to do. If you create an animation just for this sphere, you'll have to parent everything to it that you want to animate along with it. So if I wanted to add stuff, if I wanted to change stuff, that could potentially screw up your animation. So I always like to create an empty and call this something. Explosion animation. Now, anything I want to animate, I can add as a child object of this. So if you want to think about it in organizational terms, create a container inside which anything you want to animate for this particular effect goes. So any particle system I want to animate, any object I want to animate, anything with a shader I want to animate should all go under this empty parent object. So with my animation panel open, I just click create, call this something, explosion anim, and now I have a timeline with some keyframe stuff. So if I turn on record, anything I do now will be recorded automatically. So I can come to my sphere. I could scale this down. Maybe I want it to start like this. You can see when I did that, it added a keyframe for the scale. If you want to add stuff manually, you can click Add Property and add whatever you want here. I like to just click it in the inspector. So I also want this to start fairly transparent. So I'll set the dissolve to something like 0.75. Now I can move my timeline to maybe 30 seconds, scale this up, and have it fade in, maybe to something like this. Now as I scrub through the timeline, you can see it's growing, and my dissolve shader is applying its effect. Now maybe I want the dissolve to happen sooner. Maybe I want the dissolve to get to its point here. You can just click and drag these keyframes as you need to. So now it dissolves in and then grows. Now between here and here, this is really static, which is why I started to add some rotation. So I'm going to come here and I'm going to just rotate a little bit. And you can rotate a little and then set this back to 0, and that's like a short way to create a keyframe instead of like going through the add property list. I'm going to start that there, and I'm going to have it rotate fairly quickly. Oh gosh, you see, okay, so here's a great example of screwing up. So I went to here and I rotated. What I actually rotated was the parent object, not the actual sphere. So what's happening is it's getting all wonky. So make sure when you select stuff, you select the right object. So sphere, 0, 0. So now I come here with my sphere, rotate it. There we go. So now it spins as it scales up. And then once it gets here, maybe I want to rotate it just really slightly. So we go quick and then kind of slow. Then I took these two particle systems. I'm just going to copy these and I'm going to paste them in here. Oop. Oop. And all I did for these, back in record mode, all I did for these was I started them off like this, and I moved them a couple frames forward. I turned the shockwave effect on first, and then a couple frames later, I turned on the particle burst. So now, as we scrub through this, see, this is one of the problems with this is because you have to click play on the particle, it makes scrubbing through the animation timeline not great. So you can just hit play, and this will actually play in sequence like it's supposed to. There we go. What is nice is if I select the parent object, I can move these keyframes around, and that will persist. A lot of times when you edit things in Unity in play mode, when you get out of play mode, they revert, which sometimes is really good. In this case, if you mess with the animation itself, those animations will stick, or those adjustments will stick. So if I say, okay, this, excuse me, this particle burst is happening too soon. Let me grab this and move it over here. Let me grab the shockwave, move it here. Let me grab the rotation or the scale. Maybe I'll have it take longer to scale up. So you can tweak these keyframes as you need while it's playing, which is really handy. So all of that tweaking led to this explosion effect. So if I turn this on and we look at it, you can see it's just the same thing that I had. We have activating the particle systems at specific keyframes. We have the rotation occurring at specific keyframes. We have the scale, and we have the dissolve keyframing at certain points. And all that together creates, this effect. Okay, I think that's a good place to call it. That was like a ton of information, like all at once. I apologize for how quickly and potentially sporadically that was, but like I said, I've tried approaching VFX in multiple ways, and the way that I find the most engaging for my workflow is just think of something you want to make and try it. And I usually find 4 or 5 other things that could come out of that as well. Just because you tweak a couple things and it's a completely different thing, completely different system, completely different look or effect or whatever. But the key thing is, from our slides, the particles, materials, animations, and the organization. If you have good materials that have nice glow or nice effects like dissolve you can use for almost anything. It's so versatile. It's huge. The particle systems themselves are really fun to mess around with. Anything that you can't do in a particle system, you can do in an animation. So like this sphere, I could make a sphere particle system that just spawns one mesh sphere and then it scales up. But in this case, it's actually just way easier for me to go into the animator and just customize it myself. Trying to recreate this sphere, scaling up, holding, then scaling back down, rotating. You could do it with the curves in like a size over lifetime and you could mess with this curve. But in that case, I would say it's a lot easier to just do traditional timeline keyframe animation for that. So as long as you're organized, as long as you understand how you can easily manipulate parameters in the animator, and as long as you know that you can play around with these particle systems and just mess with numbers and see what happens, you're in really, really good shape for just starting to make a bunch of stuff and see what comes out. Oh yeah, one last thing. So if I did this earlier, I renamed this to like sphere mesh. When I do that, see how these went yellow? It is like, I have no idea what you're talking about anymore. I used to be telling the sphere to move. There's nothing called sphere anymore, which is ridiculous because this game object is the same game object. It has like a unique identifier. I don't know why they go by name. I'm sure there's some reason, but be very, very careful about that. If I were to rearrange the hierarchy, if I were to like move this out, it's complaining again. So it's not keeping track of the game object. It's keeping track of like a very specific name and hierarchy placement kind of stuff. So either name everything before you start animating, or if you've already animated, just don't bother. Just leave it as it is. That's why I didn't change these names, because if I do, it breaks my animation. So there's some ways around it. Like you can copy and paste keyframes and then make the change and then paste them back in and stuff, but that's a lot. So that's like the big yelling, don't change these and then mess with a bunch of other stuff, because when you hit play, it's going to be broken, and then you might have already saved and reopened your project and you won't be able to undo it. And it's going to be really, really, really frustrating. So, okay. We went over. I apologize. And there were a couple other things that I wasn't able to get to. So if anyone wants to follow up, absolutely hit me up. But I would love to take questions for as long as anybody wants to stick around. I'm all yours.
Cool. Thank you again, Bryce. This was awesome. I loved every minute of it, and we learned quite a bit about VFX and Unity. So there are a couple questions. If you guys want to unmute yourself, you can. But the big thing is, I think one of the first questions that came around was Amanda.
Okay.
What's one thing you find that you tend to always do for a scene? I.e., do you always set up lighting first before even importing anything? Kind of questions like that, I guess.
Oh, okay, cool. Yeah, so I always at least set up post-processing at the start of a scene. Even if it's a completely blank scene, like I said, I hate looking at like the blank, like default scene, and skybox and all that stuff. But even with all that, if I at least have a post-process set up somewhere, like just that alone is enough to like make my scene feel good. So I do that for everything, because it's like, I personally, I can tend to get a little discouraged. No matter what, it doesn't have to be VFX at all. Like it could be nothing visual. If I'm doing just like a generic FPS mechanic that I wanted to try out, like I wanted to try and make a hook shot and thing, it wears on me if it's the standard gray cube, gray capsule, gray plane default skybox. Even if the mechanics are sound, it's just like, like I wish this looked better. So I usually just have a post-process profile that I leave, that I can copy between. Like you could copy this, like just Control-C, open a different Unity project, paste it, and because it's all internal, it'll be the same. if you have an HDRI sky, it won't bring that over. You could like export that separate or copy paste that separately or whatever. But having like a nice couple sets of profiles with some color correction, maybe something that's more stylized, something that's more realistic, it really, really gets you in there really quick. So yeah, perfect. So you start a new project, file, new scene, basic indoor or outdoor. I like outdoor because it has a skybox. Even if it's going to be an indoor scene, it's nice to have a skybox set up. And then really, if you take the time, 20 minutes, half hour to just get a couple post-process profiles that you really like, then just move those between projects, use those as you create new scenes. Just that's kind of like your fallback, your go-to. Pro Builder is also really great. If you go to the package manager, it's in the Unity registry as well. Pro Builder right here. If you import that and you import the HDRP support, that's going to give you a lot of good gray boxing material as well. So it's in tools. So Pro Builder, again, there's a whole nice tutorial on that stuff. We use this in Concept and Tech 1 and 2. But it's just super easy. Like I just built stairs. There they are. So now I have some nice post-processing. I have some nice stairs. If I had like a character control or something, I could just hit play and I could just run up these stairs in, end of Ava world. So I usually use my post-processing, default Unity scene, and then I set up some Pro Builder stuff just to get something constructed, like a ground and some stairs or an archway or something. Just something that's nice to look at is all. So
cool. That's awesome.
That's what I do.
I do have a question.
Yeah.
Bryce, what do you think is your best advice you can tell someone when they are starting to get into VFX and Unity?
Experiment. 1,000% experiment. In addition to that, you do not, especially if you're learning, you do not have to author everything yourself. So I could learn how to make a dissolve shader, or I could download Brachy's dissolve shader and be done. I could learn how to make a glow shader, or I could download a glow shader. I could learn how to make alphas in Photoshop and export them and do all that, or I could just go to ZBrush Central and download a bunch of alpha packs. One of the biggest issues for me was I felt like if I was downloading someone else's stuff, even if they're giving it away for free, it's for learning. I felt like that was me admitting I couldn't do it on my own, and that bothered me. So I was like, no, I could do this, so I will. And then by the time I actually did that, I was no longer motivated to make any content because I spent all the time making an alpha. So experimentation is huge, but also just find stuff other people have put out there and start kit bashing, essentially. Some of you have already been doing like kit bashing stuff like in ZBrush, where you just start throwing a bunch of shapes together, machine packs and gears and all this stuff, and you can just kit bash, a mech. You could make all those things yourself, but if you're just kit bashing just to learn, then, spend the time where it's most valuable. So I would say if you find interesting shaders, alphas, effects, just get those in there. Really focus on just getting into the animation panel and the particle system panel and the shader graph panel, really. So again, those three key things, nice. Particle system, shader graph, animation.
Yeah, Josh Ushel brought up the fact of the Unity forms is very useful as well.
Oh, absolutely. Yes. Especially if you haven't. So actually, this is a good example. So with the ring effect that I had here for the explosion. Let me see if I can get it back to what it was. Let me hide this here so we're not staring into the sun. And I'm gonna set this to looping just so it constantly plays. So what was happening to me here was the default particle size was 0.1. So I was looking at this ring, and I was like, okay, I want this to be bigger. So I went to size over lifetime, and I started increasing this, and it wasn't getting any bigger. So, okay, I go to start size. I increase that. Huge. It's not getting any bigger. Why? Well, if I zoom out, it actually is that big. So it's huge. But my camera is essentially controlling how the size of this particle is like rendered to me based on the settings in the renderer. So if I come down to this renderer and set the max particle size to something like 100, you can see now it's actually scaling to the size I set it to. So I just Googled Unity particle size not changing. And the first answer on the Unity forums was make sure your max particle size is set to something other than the default. And I was like, brilliant. That was so easy and so useful. So yeah, Unity forums are great, Josh, for sure. Okay, I found the question. I'm looking through. Oh, Patrick left, but bye, Patrick.
Yeah. Anybody else have any questions, guys? It looks like not. So yeah.
Oh wait, Amanda did have one more.
Go ahead.
The way you attach particles to an actor is by just making sure the drop down near the text static button has the right particle attached.
Yeah, sorry if that doesn't make sense. I was just away real quick. Yeah, what I mean is like where you just unchecked, right to the right of that.
This?
Is that to the right? Yeah.
Right, you mean the actual right?
Yeah, the actual right. Yeah, I was wondering if that's where, not the static button, but that drop down. Yeah, if that's how you can child something to a parent.
Oh, no. That's just dragging and dropping in the hierarchy.
Oh, okay. Gotcha.
So,
I forgot it was that easy.
Yeah. So if like I wanted this beam effect like to be like on this, I just drag it onto here and it's not parented.
Oh, that's super easy. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem. No, yep. That's just how you do it. The other thing that we were doing with particle specifically, local versus world, was the simulation space stuff. So like if I move this, all of it moves with it. But if I set the simulation space to world, then the raindrops stay. So that's another like non-parent hierarchy thing that you could mess with too.
So just pretty much following the particles like as they go, like in real time.
Yeah. If it's set to local, it's essentially like the particles are parented to the emitter, and if it's set to world, then it's like the particles are spawned and then unparented.
Oh, okay, cool.
So different effects for different things, because sometimes you want it to persist in the world, sometimes you don't. Simeon, hi Simeon. Would you use noise to make a crackling effect? Oh yeah, absolutely. Like so like for this fire, I don't know why I called it fireball. It's not. It's just a fire. But if I were to like highlight these, so on the parent object here, which is why I always create a parent object because it's nice to have stuff, I could just add like an audio source here. And if I had an audio clip of like crackling fire, I could put that on there. And we could even make it like, we can make it loop, play on awake. There's some 3D sound settings with the gizmo that shows like the range of like where the audio reaches, and then like the fall off for like the distance of the volume. So with this, now it would be like a nice crackling, like here they are. Also, if you wanted your rain to have puddles, you would play around with collision. Yeah. So right now the rain effect here has like a little bit of a splash. If you wanted it to be a little bit more realistic, what you would do is on the plane itself, like the plane that this is colliding with, you could do like a panning normal map that would be like a noise texture that's just panning a normal map, and it'll be like kind of like the surface of water. It'll give kind of that effect as an additional enhancement to the splash itself. And you could even with this ring particle, like you could have another sub emitter that's like a little bounce, like where little spherical particles spawn and like bounce up and then fall back down too, if you wanted to. You said, I mean, for making the particles crackle regarding movements.
So if you want the
instead of audio. Yeah.
Yeah,
I see.
Other noise.
Noise as in like the noise of the particle, not noise as in a sound. Sorry. Okay. Yes. So for noise, what you could do, so for something like lightning, a lot of times lightning is just a texture sequence effect where it's like 3 or 4. In fact, there is a lightning with Merz's lightning. So he has like a lightning bolt effect, and there's also, I think, a texture sheet of lightning that's like that like iterates through like a sequence. So you could approach it that way. What you could also do is if I took, let me take the rain. I'm going to duplicate this. I'm going to put it over here, and I'm going to hide it. And I'm going to hide the fire as well. So if I took these raindrops, and I don't need that. I don't need the collision or the sub-emitter. I actually don't need a lot of these either. I'm just going to do one, I think. And then for the shape, box is fine. And then for the start speed, we'll leave it at that for now. We'll see if it's slow. We'll leave the lifetime, and we'll leave set the size maybe a little bit higher. And then for this rain, I had used a stretch build where we'll just go back to normal build. So what you can do that we didn't really talk about is this trail. And I have a test trail, I think. Effect. Yes, I do. So you can assign a trail effect, and I'm looking for the slot to put the material. Where did it go? There it is. So when you turn on the trails component, it'll add a trail material in the renderer. So I can put a trail here, and you can see now there's a trail being emitted with the particle. So now, like you were saying, if we turn on noise and we turn up the strength and the frequency a lot, maybe more, there we go. So right there, boom, lightning. So because it's a single particle and because it's really noisy, it's like scrambling all over. But by adding a trail, we have this little effect. And in the trail category, you can actually change some parameters there. So you could change the width of the tail. You could change how long the tail lives. So we can make the lifetime like really small. So this is kind of like a little critter scuttling along. We can make it really long so that the lightning lingers. We could change the vertex distance. So if this is a little sharp, we could lower the vertex distance so it smooths out. If we increase the vertex distance, you can see it's not really wobbling as much. It's not as finite with its. So I usually leave that alone. But yeah, so that's a way. And then we could change the speed. So if we set the speed to like 50 and between 50 and 80, now it's going a lot quicker. And then we could have the trail like not linger as much. So we could lower the lifetime of that. So it feels a little bit more appropriate. But yeah, what's cool with that is you could even, well, we can't with mine because my thing is broken, but you could still do, you could do color over trail is really fun. If I set this test trail to just like a standard one, so like the default particle lit, it's not going to glow, but I could show you how the color could affect it in a cool way. Let's see if it's going to take a while to think. Yeah, gross. Why is it still? Oh, the trail, right. Here. That's all fine. Let's just put this default back. There it is. So if my material was actually hooked up to the color properly, you could do this color over tail, and you can make this a gradient. And then we could pick like something like this, and then it's kind of difficult to see, but you can see now that the trail starts blue and then goes to red over the length of it. It just looks really flat. But anyway, so
that's awesome, Bryce. Thanks. I think the last thing is Amanda says, honestly feels like particles are much more streamlined in Unity versus Unreal. Do you think that's true? And then we'll end it off with that, though. So.
Perfect. Yes. Oh yeah. No problem, Simeon. So Unreal is Unreal and Unity are moving on different trajectories, kind of towards where the other one was lacking. So Unity, the Unity particle system like this, is actually what Niagara is moving towards. It seems to me, at least, from Eli's presentation. Where I believe they talked about Niagara. where it's a lot of these random numbers, random parameters, colors of a lifetime, speeds, all this kind of general parameters. Those existed in the particle systems in Unreal before, but I think in the new Niagara system, they're a little bit more structured like this is. Interestingly enough, Unity a few years back came out with the VFX graph. So this visual effect, I believe, is like a completely different workflow than what we were just talking about. Let's see so this is like another way to author particle systems. This is a lot more similar to Unreal's original particle system, with like having individual stacks in order of what things do. So this is also like, I think this is more CPU based, whereas the other one is more GPU based. So with this one, you can get like thousands of particles. You can do like point clouds. You can do some really, really interesting stuff with this, but it's a little more intense to get into. So like Unity's moving like towards Unreal in terms of like how it's approaching like newer VFX, and Unreal's kind of like moving more into like the language or rhythm that Unity had a little bit with its, oversized overlays and random stuff. So so it's kind of they're moving in similar directions, but in terms of just getting in and creating stuff in general, I feel like the way that Unity is organized is a little easier to get into and experiment with. In Unreal, my personal opinion with Unreal is it's a lot more difficult for me to just tweak numbers in Unreal and see the result. Because oftentimes you have to do very specific things in Unreal to get it to actually do what you're thinking it's going to do. So if I'm like, I want to make this like fade over time, I'll just tweak a couple of these things, and it's like, well, no, you have to do this, you have to do this, you have to do this, and then you can, once it's set up, then you can. So I feel like experimentation is a lot easier in Unity. Same thing with the shader graph as well, with materials, like all that stuff kind of translates between both. I would say if you were using Unity to get into it, that will kind of give you the workflow and terminology you would need to Google the things you forgot how to do in Unreal, essentially. So if you learn it in Unity and okay, size over time, that's what I'll Google in Unreal, UE5 Niagara size over time. Then you know at least what you're looking for. A lot of these things are universal. So like I said, just like with materials, if you know how to create a material, if you know what normal maps are, that stuff I'll translate. If you know what extrude is, you can use Maya, Blender, it's the same thing with the VFX. If you know color over lifetime, if you know size, if you know curves, if you know random numbers, if you know constants, if you get into the flow of how these things can layer and how they can talk to each other, that's kind of a universal workflow that you can then apply to different things. So Unreal has some other things that Unity doesn't have. Like they have a lot. They have different emitters as well. Like Unreal has a beam emitter, which I love. I've loved it forever. Beam emitters are even better for lightning, lasers, and stuff like that. Those are really great. A lot of the trails and stuff in Unreal, I think, are handled a little bit better than Unity handles trails. But by the time you get to that point of really needing really custom feeling effects to get across like your vision, you're going to know enough about it that you'll be able to just jump right in and get it going. So I would say learn in Unity and apply it in Unreal if you have other stuff already going on there.
Cool. Awesome.